أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين فاطر السماوات والأرضين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل في القرآن المجيد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فبشر عبادي الذين يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه أولئك الذين هداهم الله وأولئك هم أولو الألباب صلوا على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Az-Zumar, verse number 17 and verse 18, فَبَشِّرْ عِبَادٍ Give good tidings to my servants, الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلِ Those who listen to what is said, فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَهُ And then they follow the best of what it is that they hear and the best of what people are saying. أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَاهُمُ اللَّهُ Those are the ones whom Allah has guided. And so that guidance, to a large extent, is because of the initiative and the effort of those servants of Allah. I will look and listen to what different people are saying and try to find the message that is most in agreement with my conscience, most in agreement with my intelligence, most in agreement with my experience. Through that effort which I make in order to find and to evaluate what people are saying, and then to follow that which is the best. فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَهُ Follow what is best. That effort which I am making, Allah says, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَاهُمُ اللَّهُ Those are the ones whom Allah guides. So the guidance comes from Allah, but the means of that guidance will always be within our own lives. If I want to pray to Allah for guidance, then that means that I have to go and search what is the message of religion, the message of what is right and what is wrong, that my conscience, my intellect, my divinely given human nature, my fitrah, can accept. And if I make that effort, and then I am able to perceive and learn things that I didn't know before or I wasn't able to perceive before, then that is God's guidance, the guidance of Allah. It comes to me through people, through books, through exposure I have to what is right. وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمْ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ And the Quran says that these are the people who have intellect and have wisdom. So this is the basis of our Quranic exposure and Quranic understanding of the importance of hearing different views and then learning from what we hear, evaluating it on our own and following what is best. And inshallah, we will look at a few of those issues in this discussion, in this majlis, and then in the question and answer period afterwards, in order to understand what is the Islamic perspective with regard to how much freedom there should be for people to express their opinions and their beliefs. Now, there's several approaches that can be taken, And in order to keep the discussion most productive, I want to narrow the scope of our discussion. One question is, within Islamic law, what are some of the rules or the restrictions that apply to speech? And when it comes down to the detailed level, is it permissible to publish this kind of a book? Is it permissible to say a certain type of message in an Islamic society or a society governed according to Islamic teachings and Islamic law? That is a result and an effect of the application of the top level Islamic values. And so I want to keep that discussion maybe a little bit towards the question answer period, but not the focus, because that detailed discussion, the application of those general Islamic principles, that will depend on many factors. Some of those factors are the principles of Islam themselves, but other factors are also relevant, including what society is ready for and what kind of secondary or third level effects there may be to the application of certain laws. Let me just give one example to illustrate that point. In Islam, we have very strict punishments for certain crimes. For example, the punishment for theft is mentioned in the Quran itself. فَاقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا, cut the hand of a thief. And that is according to the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, to refer to the four fingers, but not to the entire hand, not including the palm, not including the thumb. So it's the four fingers, which is to reduce the functionality of the hand, but not to entirely make a person unable to use their hand. That is a very strict punishment. And many people object to corporal punishment in Islam. Now, it's a separate discussion whether that punishment can be applied in our present circumstances in today's society, and that is not the question that I want to answer. But because this punishment is mentioned in the Quran, I want to mention a few points about it. Number one, these punishments are meant to be exemplary, and therefore the strictness of the punishment is not a reflection of the fact that the majority of people who commit a crime should actually suffer that punishment. Islam is not saying that because the punishment for theft is strict, therefore a Muslim should hope that every thief is going to undergo that punishment, or everyone guilty of another crime for which the Quran or Islamic law dictates a strict punishment, they should actually undergo that punishment. That is not the goal or the desire of Islam. But rather, the goal of these strict punishments is so that they serve an example and they serve to remind us of the gravity of certain sins. And therefore, by design, it is only rarely that these punishments are actually going to be carried out, because Islam has a very strict standard to prove that a person is guilty of a particular crime. And then even if a person is guilty of the crime, and even if it is proven, then there are many factors that result in the punishment not being applicable, including if there is a theft that is committed because of poverty, or because of a general famine, or a general social circumstance where people are deprived of their basic needs, which might motivate a person who would not normally steal to commit theft. So these punishments, they are exemplary. What that means is they are to remind us that adultery, theft, the false accusation against the honor of an upstanding Muslim woman, these types of very grave crimes that are mentioned in the Quran, they are to be punished strictly because they are severe crimes. But then Islam says that in many cases, the reminder of the severity of the crime is the primary purpose, not actually carrying out that punishment. And so in some cases, Islam has made an almost impossible standard for the crime to be proven. In other cases, the standard is a little bit easier, but Islam has said that there are mitigating factors. There are certain factors which, if any one of them is present, then that punishment is not going to be carried out. And there is a general principle that applies to all of those punishments. تُدْرَأُ الْحُدُودُ بِالشُّبُهَاتِ. If there is any shubha, any reason for doubt about whether the person is guilty, whether they had an excuse, about whether the punishment should apply, any form of reasonable doubt, then tudra'ul hudud, that punishment is not meant to be carried out. So the general point that I want to make is that when it comes to the application of an Islamic principle, even if it is a punishment like the punishment for adultery, like the punishment for theft, like the punishment for false accusation against the honor and chastity of a Muslim woman, even those punishments that are explicitly mentioned in the Quran, the actual application of those punishments is something that depends on many other factors, and we cannot just say that they are going to be carried out. There is one opinion among a number of the top-ranking scholars of the school of Ahlul Bayt, which says that these specific punishments in Islam, they require the wisdom and the knowledge of a ma'asum in order to know when they are to be carried out. So Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, the Imam of our time, Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan al-Askari, ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif, our Imams, they know when is it proper to carry out the Quranically prescribed punishment for theft or for other crimes in such a way that it establishes justice within society and it prevents other people from committing those crimes. And when is it not going to be proper? When is it maybe going to backfire or cause a backlash or cause more harm than good? And so one opinion among some scholars, not all, but this is one of the opinions that exists among the fuqaha and the scholars among the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, is that when the ma'asum is not present amongst us, some or all of these strict punishments, although they are part of the Quran, although they are part of Islam, they should not be carried out. That doesn't mean that they have been abrogated or they are not part of Islam, but rather because the carrying out of those punishments requires a context. It requires a full understanding of all of the direct consequences and implications, and then the indirect and second and third order effects, and that is not possible for somebody who is not a ma'asum. But even beyond that restriction, there is a general principle which we have in Islam, and this is that all of these laws, they are based on a certain logic and a certain value system. And if we are not able to fully understand the application in detail of these laws, we are able to understand the value system that the laws rest on. And that is where I would like to keep our discussion primarily today. What is the basis and the value system because of which Islam has given us certain specific teachings and laws about our speech? If we understand that value system, then we can gradually move towards examples and applications, but we can also remember that There will be uncertainty. There may even be disagreement and discussion about the application, but the principle is something that we should be aware of and we should give importance to. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. So when it comes to our speech in particular, let me begin with the Islamic conception of our existence. Islam believes and it teaches us that we have an individual existence and we also have a collective or a communal existence. And both of these realities are true and they have an effect on our life, our culture, our religion, our history, our beliefs, and our values. They have a very real effect on our physical health and well-being, on our economic and our social well-being. There are some studies that do express now how there are certain sicknesses that either are exclusive to the Western lifestyle or a particular culture, or those illnesses express themselves in a unique way in different cultures, whether it be postpartum depression or other psychological or physical illnesses. There is a real effect that comes not from our genes, not from our physical environment, but because of the culture and the value system that we are a part of. Our society, our collective existence has a measurable and a real effect on our physical and our emotional health, just like it has an effect on our economic and our political lives. So what does that mean? It means that we are individuals and we are also members of a collective. We are members of communities. And therefore, Islam says that rights also should not be seen to apply only to individuals, but rights should also be seen to apply to that community or that collective. Just like it is important for me to make sure that I am respectful of your rights as a human being, as an individual, I cannot poison the atmosphere in a way that is going to damage your physical health or well-being. I cannot fire a gun into the air in a way that physically threatens your safety and your well-being. Similarly, because your existence is also something that has a cultural and a mental aspect, I have to be observant of the rights of that collective, of that group existence that each and every one of us is a part of. And actually, we can go one step beyond that as Muslims and say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala khalaqa as-samawati wal arda bil haqq. He has created heavens and earth through haqq and with justice and with what is right. And therefore, rights belong not just to me and you as individuals, and not just to me and you as members of communities and collectives, but rights belong to everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. Beyond human individuals, beyond human societies and human collectives, animals have rights. Plants have rights. The environment has rights. Everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created has a proper place and a proper use within the system of God's creation, and it has the right to be able to have that proper place and that proper use respected by everything else within God's creation. So we have a responsibility towards inanimate objects, towards other things that exist. And of course, we have a responsibility to other individuals, and we have a responsibility towards that collective. So this is one principle, and this has an effect in our understanding of the economic system of Islam, as well as we discussed in brief in our previous session. Islamic economics respects both the needs of the collective and the needs of the individual. And therefore, Islam does not sacrifice individual property rights, individual rights for the greater good of the nation, nor does Islam say that the only being who has an economic existence and who has economic rights is the individual, but rather both of those, they are real parts of our existence, and both the individual and the collective has rights. So what does that mean when we say the individual has rights and the collective has rights? That means that in principle, I should not say that every individual gets to define what is Islam, because Islam is the collective patrimony, the collective inheritance of all Muslims. Let me give an example to make this a little bit more clear, and then maybe it will be easier for us to understand. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let's take an example of what is sometimes known as the commons. Say we live in a town, and each of us has our own small house and yard in that town, and maybe a small farm. And then we have roads that bring us to the town center. And that town center, it may have a park, it may have public buildings, it may have other resources that are available to everybody, maybe an orchard with trees, maybe a lake or a stream, other public resources. When it comes to my individual home, then I still have restrictions on how I can use that home. If I start working with toxic chemicals and I put a factory in my home, the noise, the pollution, the harm that comes to others, even if I'm not doing anything outside of my own property, that means that there is a reasonable restriction that my neighbors, my society might put on me, that in this home, it's your house. You can paint the walls whatever color you want. You can add an extension into the back of the house if you want. You can chop down a tree in your backyard and plant another tree if you wish. So you have some freedom to do what you want, and nobody else should say that I don't like the color that you chose. You've painted your walls orange, and I think orange is an ugly color, and therefore you need to paint it a neutral off-white color. That is your decision. But of course, you don't have the freedom to create pollution, to create noise, to create other nuisance for your neighbors or for others, or to put them in danger. So you have a greater degree of freedom within your own land than you do elsewhere. But what about when it comes to the commons? Well, in that case, you still may have the right to access and to use the commons because it is public property. But the minimal restrictions that you had in your private property will become greater when it comes to the commons. Why? Because the ownership, so to speak, is not just yours, it also belongs to other members of society, and not even other members of society, but also to future generations, people who are not even born yet. They also have a stake in that commons. And so it's not proper, even if everybody in the village votes and agrees that we are going to pollute this common space, we are going to dry up this lake, that might still be unjust if there is no greater good in that decision, and therefore it damages the rights of future generations, or if it damages the rights of other living beings that make use of that public space, the squirrels, the rabbits, the birds, and so on, that also make use of that public space. So when it comes to physical property, all of us are able to understand that distinction, that you have private property, and although there are still restrictions, they are minimal restrictions. But when it comes to the commons, when it comes to public property, because there are more stakeholders and there are more owners of that property, the restrictions of how you can manipulate and how you can use that property are justifiably greater. You still have a right because you are also a stakeholder, you are also an owner, but you can't use it the way that you may wish. If that example is clear, then the insight that we gain from Islam is that our values and our religion are like that commons. Just like there is a physical public property, that park, that public space that belongs to everybody, and everybody has a right to it, but everybody has a responsibility to it. Similarly, there are certain concepts, there are certain values that are public property, and therefore I cannot use them just the way I want. Because if I say that, well, Islam for me is whatever I want it to be, I can define Islam however I want, then the masjids, the scripture, the 1,400-year history of the ummah of Prophet Muhammad, and in reality, according to our belief, that ummah is a continuation of the ummah and the teachings of the previous prophets, all of that might be jeopardized and all of that might be put into question by decisions and words that I might say. And because this is a shared property of humanity, a shared property of the members of the Prophet's ummah, both those who are alive and those who lived in previous generations, and those who are going to come in the future, I have a responsibility to be respectful of the rights of others to this commons, to this shared property. This is why I don't get to define what Islam means for me, because it's not just my property. It's not my home where I can paint the walls whatever color I want. It is the shared legacy, the shared property, the shared inheritance at the very first instance of all Muslims, of all members of this ummah. And so to honor that shared property, that requires me to limit in some way what I say about the religion of Islam. Everybody cannot just come and say, well, I am a Muslim, but I believe that gambling is allowed. I am a Muslim, but I believe that, God forbid, drinking alcohol is allowed. I am a Muslim, but I don't believe that the Quran is preserved without any alteration. I am a Muslim, but I don't believe that the way that Prophet Muhammad taught us to get married or to inherit and so on and so forth is accurate. I cannot do that because Islam is not just my property. In a society that believes that we don't have collective cultural and religious property, then it makes sense to say that individual rights, the individual right to speech, will be maximal. Because in reality, that collective doesn't exist. I can make up my own religion and I can call it Islam. And if you don't like it, then you have the right to say, well, that person is not a Muslim according to my understanding. But you can't prevent me from calling myself Muslim because that society doesn't recognize any kind of collective identity for the idea of Islam. All it recognizes is that you are an individual, so you can call your religion what you want, and I am an individual and I can call my religion what I want. And so you might say that I am a Muslim who doesn't believe in the Quran, and I will say that I believe that a Muslim must believe in the Quran, and therefore you are not a Muslim. But just two individuals will have that disagreement, and that society will not be able to understand why is it that somebody would say we want to limit a person's speech conceptually. Because when you redefine Islam, it's like you're taking that park, which is public property, or that ocean, which is public property, and you are changing it. You are polluting it. You don't have that right. If I have a pond entirely within my property and I want to put food coloring in it and make it red, then maybe I have that right. But if there is a public lake that belongs to everybody and I want to make it red, I don't have that right because that lake belongs to everybody. So in the Islamic belief, where the collective also has a real existence, I can't paint Islam a different color based only on my personal preference, because others also have a share and a stake in that religion. So this is the conceptual point that I am making, that because the collective has an existence, because Islam is the shared inheritance of all followers of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, no individual can unilaterally and individually speak for or redefine Islam according to his or her own terms. It's not my property. That's one conceptual point that I would like to make. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The other point that I think it is important for us to understand is that there is a benefit that we get from maintaining certain things as sacred, even if it means a slight restriction on our ability to express ourselves as we may wish. And because I want to leave time for the question answer period, I want to just give this example very briefly. But the reason why I want to give this example is that sometimes people think that the way for progress to occur is to have criticism, to have free speech. People will say that there is a slippery slope. If you begin restricting speech in one area out of respect for religion or for other reasons, then it will end up in authoritarianism and the restriction of people from their conscience and being able to express themselves. And all of those points are well taken. They are valid points that a legislature, that a society must take into consideration in order to ensure that the respect for religion does not become an excuse to oppress minorities, to falsely accuse people of blasphemy, or to restrict their legitimate right to express themselves in the name of protecting religion. These are valid points, and I don't want to deny them. But on the other side, I also want to say that when a society preserves sanctity and says, for example, that it's not just an individual choice where if I want to create artwork that insults the religion or the religious beliefs of a community, I should have that right. There is a flip side to that as well. Once again, just like it is a valid point to say that the restrictions on people's freedom of speech should not be such that they give an excuse to oppress people and limit their expression, we have to be aware of the other side, which is that we should not give so much freedom of speech and so much general authority that a person loses the benefit of preserving sanctity within society. What is the example that I think illustrates that point better than any other? The most clear example that we have of this is the example of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in Karbala and in Iraq. The preserving of that sanctity doesn't mean that people are not free to have a historical discussion or an academic discussion about the causes and the effects of the event of Karbala. It doesn't mean that if somebody does not believe in Imam Hussein being a ma'asum or being an imam, they should not have the right to express their opinion. What it means is that the beliefs and the sanctity that is a big part of the religious observance and the religious belief of the Muslims should be respected. A person should not have the right to create fiction or create artwork which is demeaning to the personalities and to the memory of Karbala. What is the benefit that comes from preserving that sanctity? Why not allow people individually to go and also even be demeaning if they should so desire? The reason for that and the benefit that we can see is that it brings healing to a society that may be disunited by so many forms of hatred. Let me just compare two societies. The United States ended a civil war 155 years ago. And in many ways, the wounds of that civil war have not come to an end, even though it was the same religion, it was the same society that was there on both sides of that battle. However, the Iran-Iraq war took place between people from different ethnic groups, different linguistic groups. The war ended in 1988, only 32 years ago. And many of the people who were injured, who were killed during that battle, they are still alive. And yet, in many ways, I don't want to exaggerate anyway, but in many ways, the healing that has taken place within those 32 years is greater than the healing that has taken place 155 years after the end of the Civil War, even though you would expect that it would be more difficult. And the reason that healing has been able to take place is in large part, or I would say is entirely, because of the existence of the symbols and the sanctity given to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, to the symbols of Islam, which allows people to transcend their own individual suffering as a result of a war, their own individual animosities that might exist, and to come together and to heal as neighbors and as a society. Maybe other people will look at other factors as well, but that living example is there in front of us. 32 years after the end of one war, when people who are affected are still directly alive, there is a great deal of healing. And 155 years after the end of another war, when there was less that divided the society, the wounds have still in many ways not healed. That is just one example of the benefit that comes from giving respect to sanctity and allowing those sacred symbols to exist in society that transcend our individual existence and our individual desire for expression. Once again, that does not mean that we have to respect the sanctity of people's religious beliefs and not allow discussion, not allow criticism. It doesn't mean that we don't have to be careful to ensure there is no abuse of these sanctities that is directed towards people from a different religion. But the point is to say that just as we have to be protective of people's expression and their liberties, we also have a benefit and an interest in society in preserving the sanctity and the respect for the beliefs of members of society. Inshallah, specifics and questions we will be able to address during the question answer period. But as we have mentioned, the power of the symbolism of Imam Hussein, let us remember that one of the main things that Imam Hussein alayhi salam was asking for was the ability to speak and to present his case to the conscience of the Muslim Ummah. And one of the reasons why there was such a vicious anger directed towards Ahlul Bayt is because their enemies did not wish them to speak and did not wish them to be able to inform the Muslim Ummah of what is the true nature of Islam. Very good questions, and I'm going to try to keep the answer concise, so which naturally is not going to go through all of the aspects of the question. But to begin, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Who should decide? Well, if we look at the example of the Prophet, the example of Imam Ali alayhi salam and Imam Hasan during their time of imamat, these are the three members of the Ma'sumin who had political authority, and so we can look at their example. Our other imams, they were never in a position to exercise political authority, and therefore we never have we don't have a complete answer from them for these questions, or we don't have as much that we can glean from their practice. So with our Prophet, with Imam Ali, with Imam Hasan, may Allah's peace and blessings be with all of them, we find that they did give people the chance to speak, even if that speech was something which was contrary to their interests and to their own message. The Prophet ﷺ asked for people's advice on government affairs, on military affairs. He gave them an opportunity to speak, and he answered them, even in some cases when the Prophet was frustrated because those people they had a responsibility when the Prophet gave them a chance to speak, but they didn't maintain their end of the bargain. Imam Ali did the same thing. Imam Hasan, he came to the masjid, and he and Abdullah ibn Abbas asked the people in the masjid of Kufa, now that Imam Ali has been martyred, this is his wasiyah, do you follow it? So he gave the people that opportunity to speak. So in general, there is a voice for the people in making the most momentous of decisions, which is whether to follow the divinely appointed imam or not. And so other affairs, even more so, it will not be just one person dictating, even if it is a ma'soom, who has the right to dictate, but they will, and they did in their life, give people the agency to speak. Many examples could be given from the life of Imam Ali. I won't take up time for that. So when it comes to things like Galileo, not only can we say theoretically that he would not be restricted, but the lived example of Islam is that the governments did not restrict that type of scientific inquiry. The heliocentric model was something that was discussed in intellectual circles in the Muslim world. It was generally rejected for various other reasons, but not because the idea could not be broached. So there will be certain restrictions in an Islamic society if there are messages that can create instability. Then it would be something that should be mentioned in an academic circle. There may be certain messages that cannot be said in a public environment. But the bottom line is that the practice of the Prophet and Imam Ali and Imam Hasan shows that society, the masses, will have agency and will have a share in expressing their views, and that even a controversial topic that is mentioned in a scholarly manner and an intellectual manner should not be restricted according to Islamic teachings. it might be restricted in other manners. Let me just briefly address the point about authoritarianism. That's a very fair point. Many Islamic countries, if not a majority of them, are authoritarian. It's difficult, however, to separate what part of that authoritarianism is a result of political circumstances and what part of that is a result of the social or the religious beliefs. Even in our society, nowadays there is an increasing question of whether social media companies should restrict false messages or fake news that people are mentioning. And the reason for that is now they fear that foreign governments might be able to influence an election. Why did this debate not exist 10 years ago? It's not that social media didn't exist. It's that nobody even imagined that China or Russia would be able to affect an American election. Our economy, our society was more confident and it was more dominant. So a big part of this authoritarianism is if a superpower is afraid of Russia and China having an effect on an election, you can imagine what a small country like Syria or Jordan or Kuwait would have to fear, because their economic power, their social power, their political power, their military power is not even 1,000th of 1% perhaps of America. That's not to justify the authoritarianism, but my point is we shouldn't look at it in a religious context. It has a lot to do to social and political factors, which even affect our own society, and that's why there is a change in certain policies, even in a democratic or ostensibly free society. So when it comes to the first question, I think I answered at least conceptually a little bit in my speech, which is that Islam is not my property. If I believe that all that exists is the individual and the collective does not have any real existence, then every individual should have the right to define their own Islam. If I say Islam is compatible with Ahmadi belief and you say that Islam is not compatible with Ahmadi belief, then you should be able to say you have your version of Islam and I have my version of Islam, even if they're mutually incompatible. But if we do accept the premise that Islam is the collective patrimony, the collective property, so to speak, just like a lake is the collective physical property, then Islam is the collective spiritual property of the Muslim Ummah. Then it does make sense for the Muslim Ummah to say that no, as a collective, because we have a historical continuity, we have historical identity, we have rituals, we have symbols, we have masjids. These are belonging to the entire Muslim. We have a right to self-define what is our religion. And if all Muslims through consensus say that belief in the finality of Prophet Muhammad is a requirement of Islam, then Muslims should have the right to say that this is how we define our religion. That doesn't mean that a person who has a different belief should be subject to discrimination or should be deprived of their citizenship rights. That's a separate question. And in some cases, Muslims have failed on that account. But simply in religious terms, should Muslims as a collective be able to say that, no, we don't think that somebody who says that there is a prophet after Prophet Muhammad gets to call themselves a Muslim, then if you do accept the idea that there is a collective identity, that does make sense. So that's the conceptual answer. Now, once again, people often will object on specifics, that this happened in this country, this is discrimination that is faced, and that's a valid point. I do want to concede that getting to define what Islam is doesn't mean that we get to discriminate against, or God forbid, commit violence against people who have a different set of beliefs. That's not what I'm saying. When it comes to blasphemy, this is a matter of various opinions, but the general principle that we have is that the Quran says that Muslims should not insult even the false gods and the idols that are worshipped by the mushrikeen, because then they might insult Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala adwan bighayri ilm, out of ignorance. So even if I have utter contempt for somebody who worships a stone or worships an image that they've carved themselves, and I consider that to be not just contemptible, but I consider that to be destructive to humanity, I don't get to speak insultingly to that person, because it creates, it's not just that that person is worthy of contempt. They might be worthy of contempt, that God might be worthy of contempt. But to speak contemptibly about people's beliefs introduces an element of aggression and an element of condescension towards belief. And that's not something that Islam wants. That will boomerang, and people will speak about Allah also in an unworthy manner. So the general idea in Islam is that blasphemy, in the sense that we should show respect to people's beliefs, even if those beliefs are wrong. And we can debate, we can critique, but it should not be done in an unworthy manner or in a way that undermines the sanctity of religion and beliefs in people's lives. That is a principle of Islam. Good question, and I'm going to just give kind of a non-definitive answer, because this is a matter of discussion among fuqaha. Among our fuqaha, as I've said, there are some who say that all forms of corporal or at least capital punishment should be in abeyance while our imam is not present, because it is a ma'soom who knows who is worthy of the punishment and who is not. So we can have other forms of punishment, a fine, imprisonment, other forms of punishment, but we should not be exercising those strict forms of Islamic punishment which require a greater level of wisdom and knowledge than somebody who is not ma'soom can possess. That's one opinion. Specifically when it comes to apostasy, there are some fuqaha who say that the Islamic law of people being put or being subject to severe punishment and capital punishment for apostasy, this refers to somebody who knowingly rejects the truth. Meaning, from an Islamic perspective, our physical life is a means towards a spiritual life. So theologically, the reason why I have been given life is for God to test me and give me the opportunity to reach my spiritual potential. And the lifespan that I have been given is for me to be able to run that obstacle course, that test. Once I've done that test and I've chosen faith, then conceptually God can say that, all right, you're done with life, now move on to the reward. And if I've lived my life and I've chosen disbelief, then God can say, all right, you finished the test and now go to your punishment. So hypothetically speaking, if a person knowingly chooses kufr, then they've given up, they've already, just to use an example, you have a road test. There's certain things that when you do a road test, you automatically fail, right? So for example, if you run a red light, then you don't get to say to the driving instructor, but wait a minute, I can parallel park really well. God forbid if you hit somebody, then you don't get to say that, well, watch my three-point turn. So theologically speaking, the purpose of this life is to choose. And if you knowingly choose kufr, then the purpose of your life is over. Having said that, this is a theological answer. Who gets to say that I've knowingly chosen kufr? Only a ma'soom. In other words, I might argue with you and I prove God's existence, I prove Prophet Muhammad, and I think that I've done a wonderful job. And I think that when you reject my logic, you're being stubborn. But maybe you're not being stubborn. Maybe you really weren't convinced. Maybe I really didn't do a good job. The only person who can actually be that driving instructor and say that now your life is forfeit is somebody who is a ma'soom. A non-ma'soom, I might think that you have no excuse, but you might really have an excuse. So this is why, as I said earlier, a number of our fuqaha, they do say that it's only the ma'soom who can make this determination. Some say that for all of the hudud, and some say that specifically in this case. But I said that that answer is non-determinate because it's not a matter of consensus. So different scholars have different perspectives. What I've given you is the conservative opinion, and I believe this is the opinion that we as Muslims should follow because tudra'ul hududu bishubuhat. Any kind of punishment is to be stopped when there is a shubha. And this is a shubha. If I think you're worthy of death, but I don't know your heart, I don't know your conscience, I don't get to decide your conscience based on my standards. So therefore, I have to withhold that judgment. So one is the question of hate speech. So we have to remember that hate speech by itself is not something that Islam has prohibited. Slander has been prohibited. Fitna has been prohibited. وَالْفِتْنَةُ أَشَدُّ مِنَ الْقَتْلِ وَالْفِتْنَةُ أَكْبَرُ مِنَ الْقَتْلِ. As I said in the Quran, to insult people's gods, even if they're false gods, has been prohibited. So there's certain things that have been prohibited. But if I say, not insultingly, if I say that I hate idol worship, I hate something, then without any kind of insulting, without any kind of aggression, that by itself is not something that Islam has prohibited. Similarly, when it comes to la'an, la'an simply means that it's the opposite of praying for rahmah. If I pray for rahmah, then I am praying for God to support something. And when I do la'an, I'm praying for God not to support something. And so this is almost an automatic thing. Right? If I believe that somebody's doing charitable work and they're doing good work, then just my sympathy is a form of dua for that person. Right. And if I see somebody is doing evil work, then just my aversion is a form of la'an. Right? Because even if I don't say, Allahumma la'an fulan, oh Allah, curse so-and-so. Just when I think in my heart, this person is rounding up undocumented workers and putting them in detention facilities in inhuman circumstances, oh Allah, don't let this person do that. Oh Allah, I hope this person's car breaks down. I hope this person's gun doesn't fire. I hope this person cannot detain or kill that innocent person. That's what la'an is. Okay. Right? I mean, la'an is not some kind of magical spell that we're placing on people. When I see somebody, working in a food kitchen and I say, more power to you, this is dua of rahmah. Right. And when I see somebody evil and I say, I hope you don't get a chance to do that evil again. I hope the next time you fire your gun, it jams. That's la'an. Right. Meaning, I hope God withholds his mercy and his strength from you. So no, again, it's not because it's not hate speech or it is hate speech. Hate speech is not the category that we're talking about. But even if we look at that hate speech category, la'an is not a form of violence. It's not a form of hatred. It's simply a prayer that a certain person or a certain action not be able to carry out the evil that it is carrying out. Having said that, we do need to be careful. The purpose for rahmah and the purpose for la'an is to serve a greater good, to establish what is right, to enforce what is right. So I might be very much against a certain person who is committing evil. But in a certain context, my calling it out might actually do more damage than good. So that is not a place when I am supposed to do la'an. Why? Because the reason for the la'an is I want to align myself with justice and align myself against evil. And so I have to say it in a way that helps justice and not evil. Let's say, for example, that there is a place where we're discussing two different conceptions of justice. And the majority of people do not agree with me. My job in that case is to show them why what I consider to be evil is evil. But if, let's say, for example, it's about police brutality, and the majority of people are sympathetic to the police and they don't consider there to be a problem of police brutality. If I say, may God curse those police officers who use excessive force, maybe I'm right, but I've just undermined my ability to sensitize those people to the problem of police brutality. So have I helped the cause of justice or harmed the cause of justice? I had a chance, and by saying the right thing, I made it more likely that those people are going to turn against me and maybe see me as an extremist or a radical when I'm not. So having said that, la'an is not the problem, but it must be understood that the purpose of that prayer against evildoers is to support justice. And if it's not going to do that, or it's going to cloud the picture, then it's not the right thing to do in that context, even if it's right intrinsically. So tabarra or tabarri was not added in Shia Islam. We have Surah Al-Bara'a in the Quran. We have tabarri or tabarra in Surah Al-Fatiha. غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ إِسْتَبَرَّ. Oh Allah, keep me away from those who are worthy of your anger. And the Quran tells us who is worthy of God's anger. Those who are oppressors. Those who knowingly disobey the command of Allah. Those who are hypocritical. So it's intrinsic to the logic of the Quran that you need to separate yourself from evil. You are either Hizbullah, which is not a political party, right, but it is those who are on the side of God. Or you are Hizb Shaitan, you are not on the side of God, then you are on the side of Shaitan. So implicit within the logic of Quran is that you should have a disassociation with evil. Tabarri literally means disassociation from evil. Tawalli literally means a love and an association with what is good, what we call tawalla. So that's part of Islam. Now, the expression of that, the same principle applies that we said for la'an. How do I disassociate from evil? I disassociate from evil by marginalizing evil. So let's say that there is a person, Muawiyah. Right? Muawiyah, we can all agree, is worthy of disassociation. But let's say there's somebody who is not Shia, raised in an environment where they believe that Muawiyah was one who wrote Revelation, who was a companion of the Prophet, who was a king who brought peace to the Muslim world for 20 years, who was humble, all of these fake stories that are there about Muawiyah. Right. Now, my job is to help that person realize, first of all, that Muawiyah is not as good as he thinks. Second of all, that Muawiyah is not only less good than he thinks, but he was downright evil. And then my job is to publicly express bara'ah. In my heart, whether I can convince that person or not convince that person, I need to have bara'ah from Muawiyah because I know he was evil. Right. And I know how evil he was. But the expression of that in words, in front of somebody who doesn't know, that should be dictated by how I can most effectively help that person see. So maybe the way I start is I say that I see your point. During Muawiyah's time, there was 20 years in which there was no civil war. However, the fact that he kind of pressured people to accept Yazid as his successor, that offended Aisha, that offended Abdurrahman ibn Abi Bakr, that offended Abdullah ibn Zubair, that offended, most importantly, Imam Hussein. It caused a civil war, that caused the Kaaba to be attacked. It caused the Medina to be attacked in the time of Yazid because these were the effects of Muawiyah's policies. So maybe your point about his giving 20 years of peace is valid, but maybe it's not as good as you thought. Right? Now, in my heart, that's not my belief. My belief is that Muawiyah was not a Muslim and he was an enemy of Ahlul Bayt and he is to be cursed. But I say that because the way that I express my bara'ah is by helping people see the truth. So that's the reality of bara'ah. It's always part of not just Shia Islam, it's part of Islam itself. If you don't have tawalli and tabarri, then you're not a Muslim.
Right.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So that's not directly related to free speech, but it's related to what I discussed. There is an opinion among scholars that khums as well is to be deferred. So that's not an unheard of opinion. However, the default that we have in Islam is that the laws of Islam are meant to be carried out in all circumstances, right? So we shouldn't be looking for an excuse that can we get a break on Hajj? Can we get a break on khums? Can we get a break on salat and Sawm and so on? The default is not that when the Imam is in occultation, Islam is in occultation. No, Islam is there, and even our Imam is there. But certain parts of Islam that require a ma'asum to give us guidance, those are to be deferred. So the suspension of certain things during the occultation, this is in order to be careful, in order to be conservative, in order to not embark or to encroach on the authority of the Imam. So the default is always going to be the teachings of Islam should be carried out in full, except when it comes to a portion of those teachings where we feel that maybe you need to be ma'asum. So when it comes to khums, well, when it comes to khums, this is my obligation to give in the path of Allah as described in the Quran. That وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ مَا غَنِمْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ فَأَنَّ لِلَّهِ خُمُسَهُ وَلِلرَّسُولِ. So you need to give that khums. You're not giving it to a jurist. You're giving it in the way of Allah. And if you're getting the ijazah or the authorization of a jurist, it's just a precaution to make sure that it's going in the proper place. Because maybe I will spend it charitably, but the khums is not my personal charity. I give my charity from my own money. Khums is not my money. Khums is the money of the Imam. So that's why we ask a jurist, because maybe there is an other need that is more important for the preservation of Islam. Generally, as individuals, most of us, we have a good idea of charity and who is a worthy recipient of charity, but we don't, most of us don't even know what manuscript might cost $25,000 to prevent it from being sold to a museum or sold into a private collection. Like the idea of preserving Islam's collective identity and heritage is not something that we are familiar with. The scholarly tradition, the moral tradition, the intellectual tradition. The only reason why we need an alim's permission for khums is a precaution. And if you think that you know better than Sayyid Sistani or you know better than a faqih, as long as you're comfortable standing on the Day of Judgment and saying to Allah, I spent my khums here because I thought this was the right place to spend it, you don't need an ijazah. So most of us probably are going to be afraid to stand before Allah and say, I thought I knew best. And it's safer for us to get the authorization of a faqih. But if I know best, then I can spend it myself. So does that make sense? The first answer is that by default, we're not looking to put Islam on hold. But there's certain areas where the teaching or the commandment requires specialized knowledge that even a jurist doesn't have. Right. Only a ma'asum can have. So as an exception, then we will put those things in abeyance until such time as the Imam clarifies it for himself. With khums, the recourse to the jurist is simply as a precaution to make sure that the interests of Islam are being best looked after. And if you feel that the jurist does not know, the logical answer is not that khums is in abeyance. The logical answer is that you're responsible for finding the best usage. So still you have to give it, but then now it's on your shoulders and not on the jurist's shoulders where to give it.